I'm Jessica Gwen Johnson, Manager of Government Affairs here with E Pluribus Unum. And on behalf of EPU, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on using cloud-based technologies to identify, sorry, I've got dogs under my feet, community and housing disparities. EPU was formed in 2018 by former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu. The foundation of the organization was based on the premise that we must confront the issue of race head on if we're to move forward as a nation. We focus our work in the 13 Southern states, building programs and initiatives that focus on cultivating and empowering courageous leaders who are advancing racial equity, changing the divisive narratives that perpetuate systemic and interpersonal racism, and championing transformative policy change. Through this work, we will create a vision for a more just, equitable, and inclusive South, setting an example for the rest of the nation. Today's webinar is being presented by one of our inaugural policy scholars, Dr. Stephen Sills, Professor and Director of the Center for Housing and Community Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Through the Policy Scholars Program, EPU seeks to engage with researchers to advance public policy by providing independent, in-depth, and insightful policy recommendations that advance equity and address systemic racism in America. With the program, we aim to help illuminate and challenge policymakers, the challenges that policymakers are facing while dealing with the compounded challenges of multiple systemic failures of the national response to the pandemic. Before introducing Dr. Sills, I just wanted to provide a few housekeeping notes for today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, it will be recorded and available on our website. That's www.unumfund.org, unumfund.org. We've also recently published Dr. Sills' research, Enduring Impact of Racialized Planning in Southern Cities. And you may have already received a copy of that, but if you do need a copy, please feel free to email me at jessica@unumfund.org, and I'll be sure to get one to you. You can also email me if you'd like a copy of the slides from the presentation. And Dr. Sills will be answering as many of your questions as possible as the presentation moves along. So please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll make sure that he's aware of them. But we would like you to try to keep yourselves muted as much as possible. We may ask you to come off if he needs some clarification on a question. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Sills, Professor and Director of the Center for Housing and Community Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. His academic research centers around housing, health, and labor, especially pertaining to minorities and immigrants. As a lead principal investigator, he has been awarded more than 60 external grants and is co-principal investigator on dozens of others. His work has largely been community engaged and collaborative, leading to real impact at the individual, neighborhood, institutional, and governmental levels in policy changes and new practice. His academic research is focused largely on housing, health, and labor, especially pertaining to minorities and immigrants. His teaching at the graduate and undergraduate level has centered on research methods and globalization. Sills was a UNCG undergraduate in the early 1990s when he earned his BA in Spanish. He later earned his master's and PhD in sociology from Arizona State University. In March 2022, he will be leaving UNCG to assume his new position as the Vice President of Research, Policy, and Impact Center at the National Institute of Minority Economic Development. Dr. Sills, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Jessica, for inviting me to do this talk. I'm excited to participate with those who are online. I do want this to be as interactive as possible, so do feel free to use that chat, ask me questions as I'm going through. I'm going to be first framing the issue of using cloud-based technologies for identifying community disparities, rooting it in the paper that you've been given. I'll talk just a little bit about how racialized planning has led us to the situation that we see with disparities in most cities in the South. I'll then spend a little bit of time talking about market segmentation, which is the lens we use for analyzing the data. We'll look at the process that's used for market segmentation. And then we'll go into 3 different programs that we use that are cloud-based, free, and/or subscription-based that you can use yourselves. The PDF of this presentation will be available for those who want to go back through, hit any of the links or any of the details for the programs that we're using. As Jessica mentioned, I'm at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, my alma mater and my hometown, but soon to move to a new position at the National Institute for Minority Economic Development. Briefly, again, the overview is background, understanding the racialized past and the past of racialized planning, looking at market segmentation as a framework for understanding disparity, looking at two sources of secondary data, policy map and simply analytics. I'll also give a few links to about 5 other secondary data sources that you might use. And then finally, collecting your own data using Regrid, formerly known as LandGrid or Loveland Technologies. I'll point out that if you're in planning, you might already use ArcGIS and other desktop and cloud-based software systems. The ones that I'm presenting today are to work in tandem with those who work in ArcGIS or separately for those who are not using ARC for planning purposes or have access to Esri products. I'll be drawing from several recent reports. First, the East Baton Rouge Parish Market Segmentation Study that was recently completed in 2021, and currently being used as a framework for an affordable housing intervention in East Baton Rouge Parish. I'll also draw upon Rocky Mount, North Carolina Market Segmentation Study, a segmentation that was done in High Point, North Carolina, affordable and workforce housing studies that were done in Wilmington, New Hanover County in North Carolina, and then examples from Greensboro, North Carolina as well. So I've tried to mix a few different examples in here, so you'll see maps from some various different cities. So let's start just a little bit with looking at the past racialized planning and how it impacts geography today. I'm going to put a map here. This is Greensboro, North Carolina. This is a map that's made using simply analytics. Any layperson can, with a few clicks, produce a map like this. And it's quite useful in understanding segregation. In Greensboro, we have a north-south and east-west corridor. East to west is 4085 interstate. North and south is US 29. And 29 actually came about as a product of urban renewal that divided the African-American community on the east side of town right down the middle. If you follow 29 down, you'll see that it just split what was a community that was established in the 1870s during the Reconstruction period as an African-American neighborhood in East Greensboro. You see that this city is bifurcated by 29, by 40, and the southeast side of town is 80% or more African-American, while the northwest side of town is less than 15% African-American. This 50 years after civil rights movements, which Greensboro played an important role in with sit-ins, with North Carolina Agricultural and Technical University and protests there. Yet we still have a segregated, bifurcated city in all of the data that we look at today. This is Greensboro by poverty, and we see that those same census block groups and census tracts in the east side of town have high rates of poverty. When we look at it using a different scale, we actually see that many of these neighborhoods in East Greensboro are 45 to 65% households below the poverty line. When we look at negative social outcomes, we find that those same neighborhoods have disproportionate impacts. This is a map of eviction, summary ejectment applications by landlords, and we see that in the south and southeast side of town, we have a disproportionate amount of eviction occurring. Matthew Desmond, of course, has detailed the disproportionate impact of eviction on communities of color. And we see with the Princeton Eviction Lab, similar maps like this across the country where evictions are disproportionately located in lower income or communities of color. This is a mapping of hospital admissions for COPD and asthma to our local home health system. We worked on a project with our Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Reinvestment Fund called Invest Health, our local initiative focused on reducing asthma that's triggered by environmental conditions within the home. You can clearly see that admissions to hospital were disproportionately in the east side of town, again, east of 29 and south of I-40. All of these maps have in common the redlining maps or homeowners loan corporation maps of the 1930s and early 1940s. The same areas in town that appear as hotspots for eviction, for asthma, for income disparities are areas that were redlined or yellow-lined in the 1937 Homeowners Loan Corporation map for Greensboro. In the paper that you were sent, it details that the impact of redlining along with other racialized planning really has a decades-long outcomes, almost a century-long outcome in reducing economic opportunity, economic mobility, wealth over the life course and intergenerationally. And it has had an impact then on health and other outcomes. We see, for example, that median wealth by race is disproportionate today, white families to Black families, a huge disparity in net worth. And the root cause of that is that racialized planning, redlining of a previous century. So using that as a framework, understanding that each of the disparities and inequalities that we're looking at in maps today are linked to causal factors or root causes in policies over a century ago is an important perspective to have as we're looking at what seems to be race neutral data today. We have to frame it in that history of racialized planning. If you didn't get a copy of that paper, you can go to go.uncg.edu exclusion by design, and I've put that paper up online for you to be able to access. So let's talk a little bit about market segmentation. Market segmentation is an analysis framework that we use for understanding disparities within a city, not across cities, not across the nation, but within the city, using the current data that we have access to. It's a strategy for dividing up the city by demographic, geographic areas, by social conditions, and identifying community assets or deficits. Market segmentation is used in a variety of business applications. If you're looking for site locations for grocery stores, you may use a market segmentation analysis to identify who your clients would be. If you're looking at where to locate a hospital facility or an emergency department, you might use market segmentation to look at insurance and billing and accidents and EMS calls. So market segmentation is used throughout many different domains, planning as well as business. The procedures that I'm using for market segmentation in the case of housing and community development really is centered on Alan Malik and Ira Goldstein's work. Alan is at the Center for Community Progress and has used market segmentation throughout the North and Midwest. Ira Goldstein at Reinvestment Fund has used market valuation analysis, a very similar technique, through many cities in the South and East of the United States. I've added additional information that wasn't considered in the original market segmentation by Alan Malik, looking at sociodemographic information, labor force information, housing conditions, right down to the parcel status, to the parcel level, to a house and building on an individual piece of land as pieces of that market analysis. I've added as well a procedure to verify that there's a statistical relationship between the variables that's at least correlational, if not predictive. Those of you who are in the statistics world might ask why we don't go to a more refined analysis using regression analyses. We've conducted that as well, but have found that we're quite strong and robust findings simply using bivariate analyses with Pearson's correlations and reliability analysis with Cronbach's alpha to create indices. I find it's a lot easier also to explain to a city council, a county commission, business community, those on affordable housing planning committees, about correlations and rather than regressions. Another reason we've used that. Variables that were not statistically significant in correlations are removed from our analysis. We test multiple measures of underlying concepts, remove those that have the least fit or the least impact on our outcome variables. And then, as I mentioned, we do reliability analysis throughout. The data that we collect is either aggregated up from the parcel level or down from county, parish, city, census tract to the block group. We like to use the block group, the census block group, as our unit of analysis within a city or a county. Block groups are a fairly small area, usually with 3,000 to 5,000 households. So they're fairly dense within most cities, but it's also a contained area. It's usually one or two neighborhoods together. So it has a lot of local relevance to people in the community, whereas census tracts, zip codes, city wards or precincts are far too broad with too many different types of demography, community assets, building types, et cetera, to really be able to hang together for planning purposes. So again, we aggregate up from parcel levels and down from higher levels of geography. Some of the characteristics that we're looking at are positive and negative neighborhood factors, crime data, transients data, zoning information, percentage that's single family versus multifamily, whether or not a neighborhood has supermarket access, its social vulnerability score with the CDC, its school proficiency scores with Department of Education. We look at all of these aggregate forms of information, and then we link them to the block group analysis. From the bottom up, we might be taking housing market characteristics, sales data at the address level, foreclosures, vacancy and abandonment information, code violations. We might look even at specific addresses or XY coordinates from police departments and fire departments for violent crime or other safety, public safety issues. We've been successful at working with water and electrical companies, especially if they're municipal owned, to look at shutoff addresses as an indicator of vacancy of a unit. So really we're working with national sources of data from the top down, American Housing Survey, American Community Survey, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, and then local jurisdictional data from the bottom up, county tax records, Registrar of Deeds records, 211 or 311 calls, you name it, at a local level that allows us to aggregate upwards. All of this data, usually 150 variables or more, is put into geographic information systems, in this case using ArcGIS, which is an Esri product. Here's some example maps that we've created from the city of Rocky Mount when we were doing their market segmentation in 2018. You can see ACS data here, percentage of all renters who are cost burdened, percentage of vacant housing, average sales prices, each of these at the block group level. Here are some examples from the recent project in East Baton Rouge Parish, using 2018 data, percentage of non-white per block group, median household income per block group, and percentage of families in poverty per block group. Again, we take all of the data that we've accumulated from local sources, from national sources, aggregated up and down to the block group level, and we produce this geographic information system with a series of maps here from High Point's core city area, very similar. Property crime, average renter tenure, and bars here, median age of household units. Once we put that into a correlation matrix, it looks something like this. It's dizzying, it's difficult to read. There's lots and lots of columns of information. When you have 150 variables by 150 variables, it can be difficult to tease out information. Essentially, this gives us the understanding of what is statistically related to value of a property, either at the individual parcel level or aggregated to the block group level and averaged for that block group. We find out which variables, those social variables, those health variables, those crime variables, those planning variables are positively or negatively associated with value of land, value of properties. So important to us is the sign, whether it's positive or negative, and the level of significance. And then from there, we begin to make the choice to narrow things down to variables that would be predictive of value at the parcel level, but related to community conditions, social conditions, economic conditions, environmental conditions. So this is the model that was developed for Rocky Mount. You can see the values were used as principal predicted values. We look at the number of single-family homes in an area versus multifamily homes, whether they're occupied or vacant, the number average at a block group of vacant residential business, the days that they're vacant, using postal information, the years they're delinquent on taxes from local information, whether or not houses had been demolished in a blight reduction program, whether there were code violations, how many new loans were generated or applied for in a particular area, how many of those were denied or originated, all of this from Housing Mortgage Disclosure Act information. We looked at information about the demographic composition of neighborhoods, percent race other than white, median income of households, homeowners that are cost burdened, those living in poverty, etc. Similar in East Baton Rouge Parish, we added a series of information around health using CDC 500 data, 311 calls. We were very lucky to have collaboration locally to be able to map information such as calls for complaints about drainage or flooding, mowing or trees, recycling or trash, even mosquito and rodent calls, which we found were statistically significant and related to neighborhood conditions. So using what's available locally and matching that information with secondary data that's available nationally, we build a model that's unique to each of the cities that we're working with. So each of these measures are different. Some are in dollars, some are in tens of thousands of dollars, some are land, some are percentage of people. We needed a way to flatten out that information in a way so that we could build a score or an index that would be interpretable. And so we used z-scores. A z-score is simply a way of plotting the distribution and differences within a data set across a continuum, in this case, a bell-shaped curve. We're looking at the mean or average as being 0, and the distribution of scores across standard deviations outside of that mean. We then ranked those z-scores in in a 1 to 5 level, 1 being stable, 2 being functional, 3 being constrained, 4 being weak, and 5 being extremely weak. You can use a variety of nominal scales to describe this, but this worked very well for us and aligned with the Center for Community Progress's recommendations for each of those levels of measure. The measures were then added together into a summative index, and that index essentially ranked one neighborhood to another within a city. And I want to point out that note at the bottom. What works in one city might not work in another city as comparison. So it's city specific or block group compared to block group within a jurisdiction. Another way to think about this is almost as an equity score. Neighborhoods that are extremely weak are inequitably resourced. They have more deficits and fewer assets. And if we again apply that lens of racialized planning, we see that that's a historical product of disinvestment, urban renewal, redlining, and other activities that have led to extremely weak market conditions. Let's look at this in a perhaps easier way. If we color code each of those statuses from stable to extremely weak, red to green, we can begin to kind of order neighborhoods against each other. In this case, we're looking at Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and some of the variables across the top that were statistically significant in relation to our market value. The average year that buildings were constructed, how much percentage was single family household versus multifamily household, how many were occupied versus vacant, and so on. When we rank order these scores, we can see how it kind of very clearly falls out visually, with some neighborhoods being very stable and other neighborhoods being extremely weak. This is another view of the same information. Those then can be mapped, and we see on the map on the right that the extremely weak neighborhoods, those that had low scores across the board, were concentrated, in this case, around the downtown area and in the curve of a river that passes through Rocky Mount. It's a river that actually floods quite often and impacts the low-lying areas of Mill Village, Happy Hill, Duke Circle, Central City, and Lincoln Park. That area was the area that was planned for African Americans in the 1920s and 30s and restricted development. We often see that linkage between environmental conditions like floodplains and the racialized planning in the past. Thinking about market segmentation and what we can do about it, the red to green kind of aligns with some tactics. Green areas might just need tactical code enforcement on individual properties. Lighter green might need neighborhood action plans for revitalization or specific hotspots of activity that need to be addressed. Asset-based micro plans might be for those that are transitioning between yellow to orange. These are localized programs that might include building new assets, a community park, walkability, a supermarket, or other anchor program. Property acquisition might be the right planning intervention for for orange areas, areas that are in transition, that are constrained and shifting towards weaker markets. Blight elimination plans and redevelopment plans, kind of reclaiming vacant spaces, types of activities for those that are extremely weak market areas. There's the core city of High Point. This actually became part of the consolidated plan for the last 5 years after conducting the market segmentation analysis. Habitat for Humanity, Community Housing Solutions, Tiny House Development Corporation were all enlisted to do housing rehab, infill development, working on finding tax delinquent or vacant parcels and in those red areas and turning them into more thriving neighborhoods. Here's East Baton Rouge Parish. And again, we see in neighborhoods that are on that I-110 loop towards the river, areas that have flooded historically, areas that have been disinvested in, and some industrial areas are clearly coming out as extremely weak. That we do see in that southern area where I-110 meets I-12 and I-10, that there are some pockets of extremely weak areas there. And then east of the mid-city area, there are also some pockets of extremely weak using the market segmentation analysis we just conducted there. So where do you get some of this secondary data? I'm going to be walking through Policy Map and Simply Analytics, two tools that we use that really anybody can use for getting secondary information. This is generally federal level data, sometimes proprietary data that is useful in planning purposes. I'm going to start off with Simply Analytics, and I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint, but I'll let you know that the PowerPoint goes step by step, showing you each of the features. So if you want to go back through the PDF of the PowerPoint, you'll be able to follow along. I'm going to jump over to a different screen here. And I might have to relog in here. Yep. When you go to Simply Analytics, you have the option of an account sign-in or a guest sign-in. This guest sign-in allows you to access any of the data and information that I'm going to be showing you. You just can't save your work. So I'm going to enter my credentials here. Go into Simply Analytics. It takes a moment to load. I have pre-populated this one. I'm going to click to my map view with New Orleans, since many of you are in that area. I've loaded some information, including total population, age over 65, educational attainment, median household income, those with $100,000 or more, average per capita income, number of housing units, percentage of renters, percentage in poverty, and percentage African American. And currently it's showing median household income. Navigating Simply Analytics is very simple. On the left side, you'll see the different data categories that you have: poverty, income, age, household characteristics, market segments, but these market segments are those for business purposes, like American Royalty, Platinum Prosperity, Kids Cabaret, Kids and Cabernet. Each of these are a purchasing segment of the market that is used often by those who are doing site selection for business purposes. There's health data in here, there's finance data in here. Much of the data is American Community Survey, Department of Labor, Simmons Analytics, which is a household survey on purchasing and expenditures. So quite rich data set. The levels of geography available range from states to Nielsen market areas, counties, cities, counties or parishes, cities, zip codes, census tracts, and block groups, with block groups being the most refined available. You can compare cities, you can create comparison tables and ranking tables, very quickly generate reports. Here's a quick demographic overview. Just clicking quick reports gives me a comparison between New Orleans and the United States. I might decide that I want to compare New Orleans to Louisiana overall. So I can add that to my comparison. Is that where I want it to? And make quick comparisons between various cities and states and counties, or to the United States itself. In the map frame, working with block groups, I'm going to go over here to the legend, and I'm going to click Edit. The default category for all maps is going to be national quantiles. This is comparing these block groups to block groups in the rest of the United States. Most of my work centers within a city or within a county or parish. And so I like to compare block groups to block groups within that area. So I'll usually switch over to natural breaks local. And this simply is a different way of arranging the category ranges that are available here for within that, that specific geography. So median household income, New Orleans, by block groups using natural breaks. We have the first category up to about 36,000, the second category just under 60,000, the third category just under 90,000, the fourth category up to 132,000, and then finally from 132 to 250,000. We see that there's some dark blue areas. These are the areas that most wealth is concentrated. I can zoom in on any of those locations and get down to a very refined view with individual streets indicated, parks and other natural features. If I want to, I find sometimes when I'm presenting this information to a lay audience, they don't want breakdowns in such odd numbers and explaining to them, well, this is where the data hung together is too complicated. I might simply round off these numbers. So each of the categories are editable. 60,000, 90,000, call that 125,000. And I've made a mistake somewhere in here. There we go, too many zeros. And it will create a cleaner legend for use with city council, planning agencies, community organizations, nonprofits. A little bit easier to interpret and understand. I might fix these two categories that correspond with programs. Often we have programs that are for 20%, 40%, 60%, 80% of area median income. So I might then fix these categories to those and produce my map that way. Once I have a map that I like, at a view that I like, I can begin to play with that or use that for distribution in other applications. One thing I like to do is apply a location mask so that I'm only looking at the jurisdiction that I'm interested in this case, the city of New Orleans. And I might want to export that as a JPEG or a PDF. I might want to use it in a presentation. So I click my export button and my layout button. I like to move my legends down to the bottom right and include a north arrow in mine. There's a few other features. You can add text labels here if you want to highlight something. But in just a few simple steps, I've taken national data, localized it, customized it for whatever use I have, and now exporting it directly to my computer or to my email in a variety of formats, PNGs, JPEGs, SVGs, and PDFs. I'll just download that real quickly. It takes it about 30 seconds to process. And now I've got my map that I can use in a report, a presentation, etc. Well, I can also export the information itself. me switch to, let's say, the quick report. I can export much of the data that's in here as Excel sheets, CSVs, DBFs for later use in analysis. So this, for example, is the demographic information for New Orleans, Louisiana, and US comparisons, and I can export that very quickly. Let's look at just a couple of other data points in here. I'm going to switch back to my map view. Let's look, for example, at housing. I'm going to add a new variable to my data categories that I have there. Let's look at percentage tenure by race, Black owner occupied. And it's going to recalculate my map. Again, the default is national quantiles. I'm going to change that to local breaks. So I have local data compared to local data. I'm going to look kind of at my my category ranges and decide, are those interpretable? Can I understand them clearly? Again, I like to round things off. So I'm going to go to 15%, 40%, 60%, and 80%. Just makes it a little bit easier to understand. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. And I can begin to see that let's change my color coding here. Change it to darker blue. The darker blue areas are areas where there's higher percentages of African-American owner-occupied properties. In these dark blue areas, 80% of African-American homes are owner-occupied here rather than renter-occupied. Again, very useful for looking at equity interventions, at targeting particular neighborhoods for different types of programs. If we see an area that has a low percentage, like less than 15% African-American owner-occupied, we might do a home buyer intervention in that area, a down payment assistance program, a credit renewal program, a home buyer education program, maybe even a community land trust or other mechanism for pipelining individuals from renter to homeowner occupancy. Any questions on Simply Analytics before I move on to the next program?
I don't see any in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to move on to looking at Policy Map then. Policy Map is a product from the Reinvestment Fund, and it's a policy center there. A very useful tool that adds additional data points that we don't see in Simply Analytics. I really like Simply Analytics for its ease of use, for the ability to create a quick, very readable map. You don't have to have a degree in geography or hours and hours and hours of ArcGIS experience to make something usable. But Policy Map, I find, has more information available. Health data, for example, CDC information, COVID information, supermarket access information from USDA, some computed information in only a few cities, rural food access that are investment areas. It's got hospital information, substance use and behavioral health interventions, you name it. There's a really wide variety of data that's available. Economics, quality of life, lending information, CDFI activities, PPP loans, all of the same housing information that we saw in the previous application. Again, in a very easily usable format. Simply point and select. Let's use per capita income as an example. I have all of the nation. I'm going to zoom in on New Orleans. And I get for the city of New Orleans, as I zoom in closer, the scale is going to automatically change over here on the right. If I get close enough, it'll go to the block group. What I find though is it's difficult sometimes unless I zoom my browser out or I have a really large screen. It's difficult to get a really broad view at the block group level, unlike what we saw in the previous program. If I zoom back out to get a good view of the community, it's automatically going to change my scale back out to the census tract. For producing a map, I would go to print, and then I would tell it what kind of attributes I want to add to it. I want to take that title bar off. I want to keep the legend. I want to cut out just the city, or in other words, a mask view. Maybe add the print margins, and I want to save it as a PDF. And so it's going to give me a few moments here, and then it will download that for me. If you're working on a paid version, you can create custom regions. I'm going to jump to an example. We've just been working on a health equity assessment for Pittsylvania County, Virginia, and Caswell County, North Carolina, with Danville, Virginia in the middle there. That was a custom region. We worked with Partners Behavioral Health, which was a 9-county region of central North Carolina. And at another point, we worked with the Hinton Rural Life Area, Towns County, Georgia, Clay and Cherokee County, North Carolina. So again, with the paid version, there's some options that you have that you can't use in others. We can also do a few interesting things in Policy Map that you can't do in Simply Analytics, and that's using the tables and the reports views. I'm going to jump over here to the report view very quickly. I'm going to create a community profile for New Orleans. My geographies can be as small as a block group, as large as a country. And I can generate an automatic report that will give me all the summary characteristics in population, race, age, income, housing status for that location. So it's a very useful tool. If I'm doing neighborhood development, I could do this at the block group level and generate a report just for a specific block group. Finally, there's the data downloader, and it allows me to select a geography. I'm going to back up a second here and preload it with, we've got per capita income. Let's do that. I'm going to download data downloader. Oh, I'm sorry, I've clicked data loader. That's why it's a different screen than I expected. I can put data onto this, point data or data that's geographically linked to block groups. I can load my own data into this. What I was going to show you actually was you have the ability to download data. There it is in the top right-hand corner. I'm going to download estimated per capita income between 2015 and 2019. This is American Community Survey information. I'm going to select a specific location. Let's select New Orleans again. And I'm going to download that at the block group level. I'm going to confirm my download and then download as a CSV file. And what this is going to give me is the current ACS information, the 5-year estimate for per capita income for every block group in New Orleans. It's a quick way to get a lot of census information or health information or other types of information already aggregated at whatever level you want, the tract level, the county level, the block group level. Again, takes just a few moments for it, and then it will download that CSV file for me so that I can use it later in an analysis. It's going to take it just a minute. It's still thinking about it. It says it can take up to 15 minutes to download. So we're going to give that just a minute. And while we're doing that, I'm going to jump back over into our PowerPoint and talk a little bit more. Were there any questions about?
There was one question that came from Crystal. It's a broader perspective question, but she asked from a broader perspective, why did you feel that addressing inequity was important? And what do you see as the next step for this technology in addressing systemic inequities?
Yeah, I think that, well, the first, why addressing inequity? I work often from a public health perspective and think about the health outcomes within a community. We're looking at COVID's impact. We're looking at asthma. We're looking at issues of diabetes and how they're all related to inequities in community assets. They're planning issues. They're policy issues. Treating those health disparities really requires treating the planning disparities that are the root causes for the health disparities. Diabetes, geographically linked, is due to environmental conditions in a geography, not having fresh fruits and vegetables at an affordable price, not having supermarkets, not having primary care facilities. So we can use current planning techniques to address those inequalities that exist because of past racialized planning. I think that each of these data tools allows us to access the information that's needed to make those planning decisions and to target specific geographies for interventions, whether they're the health interventions, the planning interventions, or housing interventions or others. I'm going to jump back here in my PowerPoint. I hope that answered your question. We've talked about both policy map and simply analytics. In policy map, again, there's a broad range of data that's available to you at state to county subdivision down to the block group level. It can be parsed by congressional districts, school districts, watershed basins and boundaries, a variety of different geographic types. Some of the preset information that's in there, as I mentioned, there's some analytics already baked into Policy Map. Here, for example, in Greensboro, North Carolina, you see the USDA Low Income, Low Food Access Tracts. This is an index produced by the USDA each year that shows where families don't have vehicle access and where families have low income, and how that corresponds to 1 mile, 5 mile, and 10 mile radiuses for supermarkets and grocery stores. This is very useful in helping determine food interventions as well as health interventions in these communities. We see in Greensboro that those areas that have low income and low access are the same ones that were redlined in the 1937 Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. Another feature that I like that's in Policy Map but not in Simply Analytics is FEMA information. Flood risk designations, we know, are very important for planning purposes. We don't want to put new housing in a low-lying area that may flood. We don't want to put emergency services in those areas. We want to be very careful about how we utilize those land resources. This is another view, estimated median year of in which housing was built. We can see in Greensboro and in most cities that core city areas are some of the oldest housing, and then we move out in concentric circles in development. The core city in Greensboro being pre-1960s, and the outer lying areas 1990s or greater. I'm going to jump through these maps. There's so much that's in policy map that can be utilized for local purposes by nonprofits, by planning agencies, and others. This is the tip of the iceberg of the types of online resources that there are for pulling down secondary data that's federal, that's proprietary like Simmons Analytics, that's aggregated already for you. You might use local planning departments, 211, 311 systems, local universities, and public safety as other sources of data. HUD, of course, has multiple tools now online. There's a link down here to a PDF that details 4 different HUD mapping tools. And then there's lots of commercial tools like Social Explorer and City Data. And the census also has a series of interactive maps. So these links are in the PDF for you if you want to go back and look through and explore some of those additional resources. I'm going to turn now to collecting your own data, and I'm going to talk about Regrid and how you can use Regrid in combination with Google Street View for doing parcel level assessments. So far, we've been talking about aggregated data at the neighborhood level. We haven't been talking about how we go from individual address level and aggregate back up. And so we'll do so in looking at Regrid. Regrid started out as Loveland Technologies. It's actually a program that had its roots in a hackathon in Detroit. It was a hackathon that produced a piece of software that they called blight texting, and they crowdsourced residents in the Detroit area to take their phone app, take a picture of houses in their neighborhood, and enter just a little bit of information about those houses. And it created a usable map for identifying burned out construction, vacant parcels, and other information that the city didn't have, that the city didn't know. Several iterations later, Loveland became LandGrid. It's now called Regrid 7 years later. It has 151 million parcels already embedded in the system. It's nationwide. It covers 99% of the United States population. It has all of the demographics that we've been looking at from the census available within the service. There's 120 different parcel data attributes for each parcel, pulled from tax records and other local sources. 156 million and growing building footprints are now integrated into the system. You can find it at regrid.com. We've been featured on the service. As I said, we've been using it since 2015 when the Center for Housing and Community Studies was established. I happened to be in Detroit at a Center for Community Progress Reclaiming Vacant Spaces conference, met the creators of Loveland Regrid, and spent some time getting to know their software. This picture is a group of students who were involved in using the mapping and surveying tools of Regrid to document a variety of cities. We did 78,000 parcels in Greensboro, 16,000 parcels in High Point, 3,500 parcels in Rocky Mount, and just completed nearly 5,000 parcels in East Baton Rouge Parish in the Mid-City redevelopment area. And it's students that we're training to do this. They get a 2-hour training with a property inspector who teaches them what to look for, everything from what type of shingles are on a roof to what type of siding is being used to identifying foundation issues or property issues. The view in Regrid, when we're using it for external assessment, looks something like this. And we'll jump out to the program in just a moment and demonstrate some of its features. I can select a property on the right-hand view. It will pop up a picture of that property. I can switch to a bird's eye view of that property if I prefer with a satellite image. And it will give me, as I said, 120 different parcel level attributes. The address of the owner, the name of the owner, the tax value, whether or not it's delinquent on taxes, a number of other parcel level characteristics. This is an example property using Street View. I've looked at a property that we were looking at within LandGrid or Regrid. I note the image date. It's very important to look at that bottom right where Google tells you when the image was captured. If it's very old, you might want to jump over to Bing. Bing has another Street View. Sometimes their vans are out at different times from Google's vans, and you're able to get a newer image. So I kind of vary back and forth. I have found that Google is pretty good about updating their data, especially in larger cities at a frequent basis. The nice thing about Google Street View is I can slide back and forth up and down a street and look at a house from a variety of angles. Our parcel assessors are not there physically, so they need to be able to kind of move around the house to be able to get a good view. In this case, we're looking at a house that was probably built in the 1940s to 60s. It does not have a foundation. It's sitting on piers. It's been resided at some point, but you can see that it's got a lot of mold growing on the siding. It does have a fairly new HVAC heat pump over to the side there. I see that there was gas at one time that's been disconnected. I see that the railing going in is only on one side and doesn't look so secure. If I jump back and forth between views, I might be able to get more information like the carport, the status of the driveway, the fact that there's no sidewalks. In both views, I can see that there's no gutters on this house, though the roof is in really good condition. All that water is going to be dumping down on the soil, and because there's no foundation, it's going to be going right back up underneath the house. A moisture issue, an asthma issue in the making right there. I have lots of vegetation overhanging. That overhanging trees is partly to blame for the mold that's growing on the siding of this house. So how do I use this? I'm going to jump over again to my browser. Let me share that screen with you. So here's that same property. I'm able to move around that property, and I'm able to go to Regrid to my survey tool, find a property. Say I'm working this particular neighborhood. I might work down a street. I'll look at the property, and then I'll under actions, add a survey to that property. So I'm going to take 2623 Beach Street. Let's change my street here. I'm going to look over that property, and I'm going to jump back and forth. We usually do this on 2 screens. Is there, what best describes the use of the parcel? Well, there is a building of any type on it? Does the grass need mowing? Shrubs need trimming? Is the lawn overgrown? I can come over here looking at my May 2013. That's an old image. I would actually jump over to Bing to see if there's a newer image. But as of 2013, this was well kept. I'm going to say, no, it's not overgrown. Are there trash or debris? No. This survey is going to lead me through step by step an assessment of the property. Depending on the questions that I've programmed in here. And for each city, we vary that based on what the local planning agency or Affordable Housing Redevelopment Commission wants to know about those parcels. So for example, in High Point, North Carolina, we just wanted to know some very brief information. Was there structure? What was the use of that structure? What kind of residential structure was it? Did it have any signs of deterioration? Was it fire damaged? Was it open to trespass? And did it appear to be vacant or occupied? Their purpose was to use this for targeted code enforcement and reclaiming vacant properties for infill development. In other surveys, we were much more exhaustive. We went from roof to foundation, in this case, 50 some points of inspection, trying to determine the quality of the housing. As we said, we did 78,000 parcels in Greensboro like this, and then linked that information to hospital data to see where there were correlations between housing deficiencies and higher rates of asthma and COPD that may be environmentally linked. That gave us hotspot maps where we could do health and housing interventions. In East Baton Rouge, we narrowed it back down just a little bit. This was the survey that we used there, 27 data points across the Mid-City redevelopment area. You can use this same survey tool as a windshield housing conditions survey tool. If you have the person power to go out in the community, you can do this live in neighborhoods with folks driving down the street and accessing it through a phone app to complete each of the surveys. We did that in redevelopment areas when we were looking at only hundreds of houses because of the number of person hours that were needed to do so. So once we have all of this data, we can start doing things like this. This is color coding attributes within Regrid, looking for properties that there's a suggestion for demolition, that have poor building conditions, that are fire damaged, or where there are vacant lots. This in the Rocky Mount area. In Rocky Mount in particular, we developed maps for them that were used later for targeted acquisition and infill development. We identified tax delinquent, unoccupied properties that were in poor condition, for example. We identified where there were contiguous empty lots and vacant buildings, again, for infill development projects. So there are a number of ways that this can be used. Individual opportunities for infill, low-hanging fruit for repair programs. You could create scoring matrices like you see in the top right there for prioritizing investments in particular neighborhoods. And you can use it for informing and targeting code enforcement. Here's an example in High Point, fire burnouts that they didn't know about that they then referred to rehab programs. The city council was very concerned about how much lost taxable revenue was there in vacant structures. We identified 573 structures out of the 15,000 that we surveyed, about $40 million in taxable value that was going unused at that moment, 172 acres total of that city. Again, Regrid is very useful in that you can then export your data. You can export it in formats that work with Google Earth, that are analyzable in Excel or in statistical packages like SAS or SPSS. You can export them as images, and you can also export them directly for use in ArcGIS and other planning programs. We've used it in association with ArcGIS to create a quick dashboard for those working in East Baton Rouge Parish. That dashboard, oops, switch to it, is interactive. I can turn on, for example, I'm in the PowerPoint and not, not the, there we go. I can turn on vacant buildings only, and then click on a vacant area and read the survey transcript, find out exactly who owns it, what their address is, information about that particular parcel. I can look at vacant lots. I can look at buildings with structural issues. Again, very useful for targeted development purposes, or in this case, for a nonprofit that wants to then investigate whether these owners need assistance in addressing severe structural issues. Back over to our presentation. There we go. So kind of to sum up, we can take information at the parcel level using programs like Regrid and collecting data on our own, using secondary data that we capture from services like PolicyMap and Simply Analytics, other cloud-based services like city data and directly from the Census Bureau. And we can combine that data using market segmentation approaches, creating an index, in this case, extremely weak to stable, most inequitable to most equitable, and really delve down to the neighborhood level within communities for the purposes of redressing longstanding inequalities within those communities. This is Greensboro, North Carolina. This is the results of 78,000 parcel assessments, data from the hospital informatics division, information from all of the planning work that we've done, combined into a single score. And it really reflects that historical redlining map. The same neighborhoods redlined and yellow lined in the 1930s, coming out as the most weak markets and areas where we're having the most severe issues. We see these tools as a way of addressing those longstanding racial and ethnic disparities within the communities by better targeting our resources to those areas that are in most need. Again, happy to answer any questions you might have at this point.
Feel free to type them in the chat if you're shy to come off of mute.
Jessica, did you have any questions or?
No, this is all, you know, when I was still in the housing realm, this would have been lovely. But this is all very good, you know, very important to be able to determine those. Where are we building? Why are we building? Who are we building for?
Right.
What pieces are we missing by not getting down at that granular level to see where those disparities exist. We hear it in a more broad sense, but I think this would be very helpful, especially, you know, not just from the planning side, but from the funding side.
Yes, I think what's amazing now is that, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you really did have to have a $2,000 license for ArcGIS. You had to have access to a planning department and its troves of data that weren't shared publicly. But because of open data portals, because of the move to get so much of this up in the cloud and usable, any nonprofit Habitat as a builder can step in and use market segmentation and infill development planning as if they were a planning department. Small towns that don't have planning programs can access some very robust information and engage in interventions. I think the key element here is really reflecting and keeping in mind that historical piece, understanding how past policies shape the data that you're seeing. If you're just looking at the data, you're saying, oh, look, that side of town's poor and this side of town's rich, and that's just the way it is. But understanding how it got to that status is very important, and especially if we're going to redress those longstanding wrongs.
I think it's also, you use the data from East Baton Rouge Parish, which is my hometown and my current parish. And the history around the neighborhoods that surround the plants right now used to be predominantly white. Mm-hmm. Standard Heights was built for the plant workers who were solely white when it was built. And now the community that it affects a lot of them don't work at the plant. But this is where they have been, I don't want to say relegated to, but previously have been excluded from.
Right.
And now are receiving all of the negative benefits, not benefit, of the environment that surrounds them. Donnie had a question. You mentioned explaining this to an audience of elected officials. Can you reflect on how that process has gone, their comprehension and receptivity?
I'm big on using red to green because it communicates everybody. My 3-year-old knows that a red light means stop, a yellow light means slow down, and a green light means go. And he tells us, green daddy go. I think that by taking very complex data, scores and metrics, simplifying it, but not simplifying it to the point where you've gotten rid of the information, and then presenting it in a visual format like these maps showing red to green, explains and directs their attention at city council and planning commissions in a way that other approaches don't. We've had great reception. When you're able to show this area is red, it is red in health, it is red in housing, it is red in economic development, it is red in workforce development, it is red in school achievement. It really turns the discussion at council meetings and commission meetings from how do we each get a project in each of our wards or districts, the equal approach, to how do we address these hot spots in an equitable approach. And that really means turning more resources to these areas that are impacted and less to areas that have always been invested in. And that politicians need that fuel. They need that fuel to explain to their constituents on one side of town why they're not getting $1 million park, but the other side of town is getting a new food service or something. So it's been very well received.
Good to hear that. Any other questions? Now, feel free to always, follow-up questions that you may have. Dr. Sills, do you want to give any information how to contact you? I know you're going to be moving soon, so that may information may not be
in the chat my new email address.
Okay.
.org. It is sjsills@theinstitutenc.org.
All right.
You can send me any follow-up there. I am accessing that email address now.
Thank you. Good deal. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I know we had a few that dropped off. They messaged me separately that they would like the presentation and the paper. Any other questions that we can answer for you, feel free to email us. If you're not subscribed to our website, please feel free to do so and find out other presentations by our other scholars and other work that we're doing. You can go to unumfund.org and there's a subscribe button down at the bottom, or you can email me with any questions that you might have. But other than that, I will say thank you. And my dog says thank you. Also, thank you to Dr. Seals for this important research and for presenting this to us today. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good afternoon. Be well, be safe.
Thanks
Take
a
care.
lot. Bye-bye.